The first time the FLAK crews heard the bombers coming, many of them mistook the sound for weather. It rolled in from the horizon like distant thunder, steady and layered, not sharp enough yet to signal danger. Men paused in their conversations, hands resting on steel railings, eyes lifting almost instinctively toward the sky. Clouds drifted lazily above them, white and harmless, giving no hint of what was hidden behind them. In those early moments, before alarms screamed and orders snapped through the air, there was still a fragile sense that this was manageable, that the sky could be read and controlled like a map. That illusion shattered quickly. As the engines grew louder, the air itself seemed to thicken. Vibrations crept into the ground, humming through boots and bones. Officers began shouting commands, their voices edged with urgency, and young gunners scrambled to their positions, fingers stiff with cold and anticipation. Anti-aircraft guns were swung upward, their dark barrels angling toward a sky that no longer felt distant. Somewhere above the clouds, hundreds of men were flying toward them with mechanical precision, unaware of the individual faces now staring up in return. For the FLAK crews, this was not an abstract battle. These were not symbols or silhouettes on paper. Each approaching aircraft meant a calculation that had to be perfect, a shell that had to explode at exactly the right moment in a vast, moving emptiness. The men worked quickly, setting fuses, adjusting elevation, calling out numbers that echoed through the concrete pits. Sweat beaded on foreheads despite the cold. Fear had a smell, sharp and metallic, mixing with oil and burnt powder. When the first shells were fired, the noise was overwhelming. The guns recoiled violently, hammering backward as if trying to escape their mounts. The sky responded with black bursts that seemed to tear holes in the air itself. Each explosion bloomed and vanished in an instant, leaving nothing but drifting smoke and the hope that somewhere inside that darkness, steel fragments had found their mark. The crews watched intently, squinting upward, searching for signs of damage, a wobble, a trail of smoke, anything. Often, there was nothing. The bombers kept coming. From below, the B-17s looked impossibly solid, their silver bodies catching the sunlight as they broke through the clouds. They flew in tight formations, box after box, stretching across the sky until it felt crowded, oppressive. To the FLAK crews, it was as if the heavens themselves were marching. Some men felt their confidence surge at the sight, so many targets, so many chances to stop them. Others felt something colder settle into their stomachs. There were too many, far too many. Orders came faster now. Fire, adjust, fire again. Shells were hauled from racks, their weight biting into shoulders already sore from repetition. Hands moved automatically, drilled by weeks of training that now seemed woefully insufficient. Every missed burst felt personal, a failure measured not in meters, but in the widening shadows passing overhead. The noise never stopped. It layered itself until individual sounds blurred into a single, crushing roar. Between bursts, some gunners dared to look around. They saw faces pale with concentration, jaws clenched so tightly they ached. They saw veterans with hollow eyes who had learned not to flinch, and boys barely old enough to shave, swallowing hard as they tried to remember their procedures. No one spoke of fear, but it was everywhere, slipping between shouted numbers and the thunder of the guns. It lived in the brief glances exchanged after a near miss, in the tight grip on a lever held just a second too long. Then came the moment every FLAK crew dreaded and expected in equal measure. The bombers were directly overhead. From the ground, there was a strange intimacy to it. The aircraft were close enough now that individual features could be seen. The cross of the wings, the glass noses, sometimes even the faint flicker of gunfire from defensive turrets. The crews fired upward in desperate arcs, filling the sky with explosions, but gravity favored the men above. Bomb bay doors opened, slow and deliberate, and time seemed to stretch thin. When the bombs fell, the world broke apart. Shock waves slammed into FLAK positions with brutal force, knocking men off their feet and rattling teeth in their skulls. The ground heaved and buckled, sending dirt and debris raining down into the pits. The air filled with dust so thick it was hard to breathe, each gasp scraping the throat raw. Some guns were thrown out of alignment, others were simply gone, replaced by smoking craters and twisted metal. The men who had stood there seconds before vanished without sound. For those who survived the first impacts, there was no pause to grieve. More bombers followed, more shells had to be fired. Orders were screamed hoarse through smoke and ringing ears. Hands trembled as they reached for ammunition slick with sweat. Somewhere nearby, someone was screaming, the sound raw and animal, but it was swallowed by the chaos before it could fully register. The sky remained full. The attack was not over. In those hours, something fundamental shifted for the FLAK crews. This was no longer about defending abstract targets or fulfilling duty. It became a fight to endure the moment in front of them, to survive the next explosion, the next wave. The belief that skill alone could protect them eroded with every bomb that struck too close, every bomber that sailed on untouched through their fire. The sky, once a source of pride and vigilance, had turned into a vast, merciless threat. As the last formations finally disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a wounded landscape and a stunned silence, the men stood among the ruins of their positions and tried to understand what had happened. Smoke drifted lazily upward, mocking their efforts. Somewhere far above, the bombers were already turning for home. On the ground, the FLAK crews remained, staring into a sky that no longer felt like theirs, knowing this would not be the last time they heard that thunder approach. High above the shattered ground, beyond the reach of shouting voices and exploding earth, the world inside a B-17 flying fortress was a narrow corridor of noise, cold, and unrelenting tension. The aircraft shuddered constantly, its aluminum skin rattling as if it might tear itself apart at any moment. Engines roared so loudly that they were felt more than heard, a ceaseless vibration that crawled through the bones and never let go. For the men inside, there was no sense of speed or distance, only the endless pull of the formation and the knowledge that turning back was not an option. The cold was the first enemy. At altitude, it crept in through every seam, biting fingers until they ached and went numb. Breath fogged instantly, hanging in the air like ghosts that refused to leave. Gunners flexed their hands repeatedly, fighting stiffness as they clutched metal grips that burned with cold. There was no comfort to be found, only routine. Check the weapon, scan the sky. Check again. The repetition was a lifeline, something solid to hold on to as fear pressed from all sides. Despite the name, there was nothing invincible about the flying fortress. The men knew it intimately, every groan and shudder telling a story of strain. They had seen what FLAK could do. They had watched aircraft peel away from formation, trailing smoke or fire, watched parachutes bloom too late or not at all. Each mission carried the unspoken question of whether this would be the one where luck ran out. No one said it aloud, but it hovered between them, heavier than the oxygen masks strapped to their faces. When the first flak bursts appeared, they looked almost beautiful at a distance. Black puffs blossomed against the pale sky, sharp and sudden, then dissolved into nothing. That illusion of beauty vanished quickly. The explosions grew closer, louder, slamming the aircraft with concussive force. The plane lurched violently, metal screaming in protest. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like a hailstorm of knives. Somewhere, a piece of steel punched through skin and flesh, and a man cried out before the intercom swallowed his voice. Inside the B-17, there was no room to run. Men were locked into their positions, separated by narrow passageways and bulkheads that felt like barriers between life and death. The nose gunner stared straight ahead, eyes straining for fighters, while flak burst all around him, his world reduced to glass, sky, and the trembling guns in his hands. In the waist, gunners twisted and fired, tracking shadows that might become threats, their bodies swaying with the aircraft's movements. Each man existed in his own pocket of fear, connected only by static-filled voices crackling through headsets. Formation flying was their shield, fragile but necessary. Bombers flew so close that wingtips seemed to almost touch, trusting one another to hold steady through turbulence and explosions. Breaking formation meant isolation, and isolation meant death. The men knew this with absolute clarity. Even when instinct screamed to dodge or dive away from the bursting flak, discipline held them in place. They stayed level. They stayed straight. They trusted that staying together gave them the best chance to come home. Yet trust was tested with every near miss. A flak burst too close could feel like a direct hit, the shock waves slamming bodies into their harnesses and sending loose equipment flying. Oxygen lines snapped, instruments flickered. Among the men, conversations grew shorter and darker. They spoke less of victory and more of endurance. Some wondered quietly how long this could continue, how much punishment a human body and mind could absorb before breaking. Others clung stubbornly to routine, believing that as long as the guns fired and the procedures were followed, some order remained. But beneath it all was the unspoken understanding that the war had shifted beyond their control. The sky, once their responsibility, now felt hostile and predatory. Each clear day was a warning. Each formation on the horizon was a reminder that the bombers would return until nothing remained untouched. The flak crews stood in the open, framed against the landscape, raising their guns again and again, knowing that they were no longer just aiming upward. They were standing in the path of a force that had learned exactly where they were. When the raids finally eased, not because the threat had vanished, but because the front itself was collapsing, the flak crews were left standing in a strange, hollow quiet. The guns still pointed skyward, but the sky had changed. It no longer roared with engines every day. Sometimes it was silent for hours, even days, and that silence felt unnatural, almost threatening in its own way. Men found themselves listening for sounds that did not come, flinching at echoes that lived only in memory. The positions they manned looked nothing like the proud defenses they had once believed in. Earthworks were cratered and uneven, concrete shattered and scorched black. Guns have stood scarred and pitted, their barrels worn thin by constant firing. Around them lay the debris of a war fought upward and downward at the same time, fragments of shells, twisted steel, personal items half buried in dirt. The landscape itself bore witness, marked permanently by the exchange between bombers and ground. Survivors moved through these places with a quiet, measured care, as if loud movement might summon the sky back into violence. They spoke of comrades who had vanished without graves, of crews erased so completely that only a missing name on a roster remained. There were no triumphs to celebrate, only endurance to acknowledge. The war had passed through them, leaving marks that would not fade with the smoke. News traveled slowly and often inaccurately. Rumors of advances, retreats, and shifting fronts filtered in, but for many FLAK crews, the larger war felt distant and abstract. Their conflict had been immediate and vertical, measured in seconds between explosions and the narrow margin between life and death. Even as armies moved and borders shifted, the memory that stayed with them was the sound of engines overhead and the violent bloom of FLAK against the sky. Some men were reassigned, others simply waited. The guns fell silent more often now, and with that silence came time to think. For many, that was the hardest part. The adrenaline that had carried them through months of fear ebbed away, leaving exhaustion and reflection in its wake. They replayed moments endlessly, wondering which shell had hit, which calculation had failed, which second had changed everything. These questions had no answers, but they lingered all the same. The flying fortresses, when they did appear, were sometimes seen differently now. No longer just targets, they were reminders of a system that had overwhelmed individual effort through scale and persistence. The bombers represented an industrial force that could absorb losses, learn, and return stronger. Against that, the FLAK crew's courage and skill mattered, but not enough to change the outcome. It was a realization that settled heavily, stripping away the last illusions of control. When the war ended, there were no parades for the FLAK crews who had stared into the sky day after day. Their story was folded into broader narratives of defeat and destruction, their suffering overshadowed by the scale of what had been lost. Yet their experience remained a crucial part of the war's truth. They had stood beneath one of the most intense aerial bombardments in history, facing an enemy they could hear long before they could see, fighting with everything they had until endurance itself became the only victory left. The sky eventually returned to something resembling peace. Clouds drifted without menace. Sunlight touched the ground without bringing fire. But for those who had manned the guns, it was never quite the same. Every distant aircraft, every low rumble carried an echo of the past. The flying fortress had moved on into history and legend, but the men who faced it from below carried its shadow for the rest of their lives.